Good morning, Art.
Good morning. Good morning. Good to see everybody.
Art and I had the special pleasure of meeting each other in person at NARUC.
That's right. And I even recognized you despite your mask.
Good. I had trouble with other people. So, Art, I understand that we have an open meeting today, not just a staff meeting, or so we won't have Commissioner Hall, I don't think.
No, she sent me a text yesterday, said that she'll try and get a break at 10 o'clock and then come and join and make her statements and then leave. But fingers crossed.
Okay, so we should stop Jeff's presentation.
No, she was going to try and come right at 10, but we'll see what happens.
Oh, that's right. 10. Sorry, 10 is your 9. Right. Sorry. I'm sorry. I'm on a time zone. Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute. What is 9? How many people? I'm going to give it 2 minutes. All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. It's 1 past. I'm sure we'll collect people as we go because we always do. So welcome to the 10th webinar of the Grid Modernization series being hosted by GridWorks for the New Mexico Public Utility Commission. We are going to do a couple things today. As you all know, the entire series has been aimed at collecting information, providing information with the aim of helping the PRC develop a grid modernization rule. It's been the entire purpose. Today, what we want to do is we're going to reflect back what has been presented in both the expert presentations and what we've heard from you all. And then we want to collect your input about how did we do? How did we reflect what we've done in this series? As you know, throughout the entire series, our approach was we would bring in somebody that was a subject matter expert, and then at the end we'd do facilitated discussions to try to draw out of you what you heard, what you think next steps for New Mexico is. And then I'm sure you all know that we've been documenting this at the end of every session, and those are all on the GridWorks website with notes. So next, Deborah, please. Thank you. So we've had a phenomenal participation throughout this webinar series. We've had 9, we've been together 5 months. We've had 10 experts presenting. We've had about 40 people on every webinar, which I think is good representation. So we've spent a lot of time together getting to know each other and trying to understand all the concerns. And I think when I think about the series, there have been definite key themes that have come out from the participants, and that we're going to delve into some of those. Next, Deborah. So these are the series that we have gone through. We talked about integrated planning, AMI and communication, load forecasting, hosting capacity, non-wires solutions, transportation electrification, and evaluation of grid modernization. Then we kind of turned to internal, and we had Art talk about how the application for grid mod might go and the evaluation. And then we have today's presentation. We chose these topics for two reasons. One is that we wanted to reflect what the legislation was saying the PRC's responsibility is, but also this is the expertise from GridWorks and best practices from other states. So we wanted to present a logic framework for thinking about grid mod. I'm going to stop here for a second because Chair Hall is with us and her time is short, but we wanted to provide her an opportunity to say a couple things. So Deborah, if you take down the slides, that would be great. And Chair Hall, if you'd like to say a couple words.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ormond. I appreciate the opportunity. We are having an open meeting right now, but I took a break because this means so much to me, and I really wanted to be present to talk to everybody here. What I wanted to say was just thank you very much for your participation and your continued interest in what we're doing and what we're trying to achieve. Honestly, I know I've said it before, but it bears repeating. We couldn't do this without everybody who participates. And I've really been humbled actually to sit through some of these sessions, especially the technical sessions, to listen to all the thoughtful comments everyone's making and be part of to be part of the enormous effort that's being made to help our state move forward. It has tremendous importance. There are not that many other states in the West who are doing this or in our country who are doing this. And what we do is really important here because other states will see that we'll make this succeed, that we'll be able to have a successful energy transition. And every one of your thoughts and comments contributes to that. And I'm getting goosebumps as I'm talking about this. As a matter of fact, I really do think what we're doing is pivotal and for achieving the kind of energy transition transition that we have to have to protect our planet. So I just wanted to say thank each and every one of you for your time that you devote. Your time is your most precious thing. And if we have more rulemakings, I hope you come back because, like I say, we can't do it without you. So thank you very much.
Chair Hall, thank you. We really appreciate how much you've been able to attend this series and all the questions that you asked. So thank you for your time. And, you know, we look forward to seeing what the next step are with this rule development. So appreciate you being able to step out of open meeting.
Okay, thanks very much.
Great.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.
So today's objectives, what we want to do is we are going to present conclusions and recommendations for rule development for grid modernization. And this is a combination of taking from the presenters, the expert presenters, and our expertise, and probably most importantly, what you all have said to us throughout the series. So we're trying to reflect back to you what you have told us. So once we go through a presentation that's going to be done by Jeff, we are going to then do our typical facilitation conversation, and we're going to ask two questions. So how well did we reflect back what you heard sitting in this webinar series? And then are there improvements that need to be made? So as you're listening to the presentation, we'd like you to keep that frame in mind. We then will close with what's going to happen with our next steps and our report that's going to be prepared. Thanks. So here's our agenda. The timing we've already heard from the chair. We're going to hear from Jeff, and then we'll do our clarifying questions and wrap up. We do have a participant survey, two actually today that are very, very brief. We hope you'll provide us that feedback because it's really important to us. Next. So I wanted to make sure that we are clear here about what is being presented today. So first is that the recommendations and the conclusions are GridWorks. They are our work product back to the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission that asked us to come work on this series. So they are our observations. We are not going to tell the PRC that this is a consensus document from all the participants, because it's not. That's not how we didn't have the time to achieve that. And that we hope that after you've heard the presentations, that you will be able to give us feedback so that they are maybe a little closer to consensus, but also they're stronger and they are more reflective of the things that you're thinking. And you know that throughout the series, we've tried to draw out the utilities because you are the impacted parties here. And so we hope that you will also give us your feedback today. And then I just want to make sure that we mention that the report that we'll give to the commission is the work of GridWorks. So it may not be that you agree with every sentence, but this is our work product to the commission. So with those caveats, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Jeff Ackerman, and he will lead us through our findings and recommendations. And Jeff, thanks very much. So Deborah, I think you want to put back up the slides, the same deck.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up from there, and I'm going to run the slides from here. Thanks.
Thank you.
So I think that's, yep, you are seeing my screen now. Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, everyone, for being here. And on behalf of all my colleagues at GridWorks, we appreciate your continued involvement, participation, active interest in this. So as mentioned, what we're going to do now from here is use about the next 20 slides and about the next 20 plus minutes to give you a sense of then, as noted, our purpose for today is recap and summarize both what we've heard and what we're recommending to the PRC. So let's see. So let's start right in here. I'm going to give you a sense first of what you're going to hear in the next 20 minutes or so. And it rolls up into three broad areas here that I think are key to how we viewed our time together here and what we've learned. First being that the foundation is clearly in place. The PRC is in a place where it can move forward with grid modernization. By move forward, it's the regulatory process of moving from rules to then seeing plans get filed, and we'll talk about what those plans are, and then off of plans come investments. And you know, and that is an iterative, repetitive process. That's what the repeat means there, sort of like on the back of the shampoo bottle. But the point being that it's not a one-time through linear, but it's intentional, that is a ongoing process. And second, that the PRC does clearly have the authority to act here, both its, and we'll talk a bit more about that, its constitutional statutory authority, and the authority is articulated when it comes to the grid modernization statute itself. And that it's thus our recommendation to the PRC to set that focus of a modernized grid and then conduct that incremental approach. And third, that all of this is complex. There's a lot going on here, and in learning best practices from others, there's a need to realize that this is a synchronized process. There's several efforts going on. It may cause a need to think about when and where to pause actual filings so that filings can reflect rules, and then how to anticipate future linkages going forward and down the path in this ongoing increasing complexity and iterative process. What's a good place to start this conversation, you heard this from many of the presenters throughout our series, is you go back to HB 233 from 2020 in the Energy Grid Modernization Roadmap Act. And so we find in this conversation with you today, going from broad to specifics, again, it's a good place to start and to realize that act comes with three particular sections. And I think it's important to understand those sections and what they mean to the drivers here of what's putting this kind of forcing function or this motivation to pursue grid modernization in New Mexico. And so I want to speak briefly to those three functions. And starting first with section 1 that called forth the Grid Modernization Advisory Committee, advisory group, and called for this roadmap to be developed. And I think the key takeaway, because there's several things here, is looking at the 5 consensus recommendations coming out of that group to see the recommendation number 1 that I've highlighted for you is that utilities should invest in advanced metering infrastructure. And we'll show how that sets the tone and why that recommendation carries through what we'll be talking about and what GridWorks is communicating to the PRC. And then through the white papers, the series of white papers, while all of them represent sort of the policy context within which the PRC and others are operating, is looking particularly at white paper number 6, which titled Required Distributed Resource Planning, and goes into fairly good detail to set forth that distribution system plans should be submitted, require them to be submitted, and detail about frequency and content of such, and integration of such, which fits right into messages that we are capturing out of this process to be shared with the PRC as well. Looking also at the House Bill 233, now looking at Section 3, this is important to draw attention to, because this is the section that speaks in particular to public utilities and speaks to the PRC. And a key thing amongst all the content in here is to realize that there is both the call for that is that language of law saying may file, speaking to public utilities, may file an application regarding grid modernization and talks through what an application may include, but also speaks to the authority of the commission, or upon request of the commission is highlighted, because it's reiterating that there is a proactive authority vested generally in the commission and specifically in this context of grid modernization, and that it's important to draw that out and build upon that. And I think that is also one of our key messages, as mentioned, that the commission kind of embrace that authority and that initiative that the legislature is calling for there and act upon that, and in looking at what should be in these types of filings. So to that now, going into a little bit more detail, we move now from sort of those drivers, statutory and policy drivers, to looking at what we heard throughout this proceeding from the subject matter experts and from many of you in dialogue, that there are particular approaches that we need to take into consideration, that the PRC needs to take into consideration, and our recommendation will articulate such, is to keep that broad and long-term view, that holistic sense of not just what's coming next, but also how this looks toward the whole objective of comprehensive grid modernization across the entire system, to learn from best practices and lessons learned. And I commend Chair Hall, was one who many times was the person inquiring about those best practices from other states. And we heard from many of you as well, this notion of keeping in mind that New Mexico is unique. It has both unique circumstances, unique situations, both regarding where it stands on all of these components that were presented relative to other states and across utilities, where it stands socioeconomically, demographically, what we need to be sensitive to in terms of the customers who ultimately pay these bills, and the differences between the jurisdictional utilities as well, and how to factor that in, that flexibility in reasonably with each utility in this process as well. Continuing on in that sense of what else needs to be in the broad focus as we move toward rule language, is to also make sure that the driver of all this is that this is policy-driven regulation, that there are public policy goals that need to be always top of mind and woven through this process. And that's what we're driving toward. That, again, back to what we heard from many of you, the notion that this has to be done at a lowest reasonable cost, that cost has to be sensitive, if not hypersensitive, in looking at the decisions going forward, being cognizant of that, and that we're looking at regulatory practice as well. And that regulatory practice is a catchphrase for many things, and we'll talk a bit more about that. But one of the things that came top of the list there is this notion of what's represented by an approved plan, and this notion in regulatory language about a rebuttable presumption of prudence. And the message here is finding that balance between what is provided in an approved plan regarding a rebuttable presumption of prudence going forward with investment decisions by a utility, and what is an appropriate amount of ongoing regulatory oversight regarding those expenditures and those rates built upon what the plan approval represents. So I think it's important to make sure you hear that we captured that from you as well. Now we move to language itself, to recommended rule language. And first thing to see here is, again, starting broadly, as is always the case, all good rules, in my opinion, and our expertise at GridWorks starts with a statement of intent, in this case of regulatory intent. And although this is illustrative, I think this both reflects what we heard here and points back to what Art shared with us in his presentation on June 30th, is that the PRC has already provided a good starting point for stating what the intent is of this process, as reflected here in this extract out of an order from the PRC dated back in March in PNM's filing in proceeding. So we start with that broad intent. We go from there to continuing to build more specificity that in the rule language should include principles and objectives. Again, illustrative here that in doing such, examples that point to why are we pursuing this? Well, it's to prepare the grid to better deliver and best deliver on all the things that we expect of a grid: resilience, reliability, a platform for customer options, flexibility, and integration of operational tactics. That's kind of referencing tariffs and other sorts of ways, non-wireless alternatives and things like that. Again, to this point of finding that objective between reasonableness of investments and as well that what we learned, and you'll see reflected here, having to do with benefit cost calculations across the spectrum of methodologies, but understanding the benefit costs often take into consideration not just immediate benefits and immediate costs, but what is the longer term horizon? What is the opportunity potential of these, and how to appropriately factor that in? And then that, as you heard before, and you'll hear again, that it's clearly a sequential process, that we're looking at a transition underway to a modern grid, and that you're deliberately leveraging proven technologies and best practices, and that's what's driving this as well. So that gives you a sense of what we see from a point of view of how to frame the rule language. Now we're going into a bit more specifics from there as well. What you see here, getting into a bit more detail, again, the voice of GridWorks reflecting on what we heard, is you go back to the statute again, to HB 233 and into section 3 as previously referenced. And you see that the legislature took the initiative in this world of grid modernization to identify regulatory review factors. These have been referenced and presented by previous presenters in this process, but that there is very specific language here of what the PRC should take into consideration in the decision-making process. And that in bringing this in, these 7 factors, it behooves the PRC to draw upon that language and then work with that as it's now framing more specifically through rule, how the decision-making process will be done, how the engagement will occur in this world of grid modernization. So again, drawing from what we see in statute and what we've heard from presenters. We continue into rule language in an increasing amount of specificity, getting into a little more detail now. I think it's important to also reflect back on HB 233, outlined the component parts of what is in grid modernization. And so we see here that these being the component parts, and that the legislature has spoken fairly clearly on this, that we're at a point now where as the PRC engages with utilities, that it call upon utilities to file what we're referring to here as a grid modernization plan. It continues, and the work that's already underway and addresses this range of component parts of grid modernization. Again, reflecting the flexibility that utilities look at how these pieces fit together and their sense of sequence and prioritization, but that this is the language being used to discuss grid modernization and grid modernization planning. And that it's by bringing this all together that we move beyond incremental standalone proceedings to a more comprehensive nature of building a modernized grid in New Mexico. And to the last bullet point here on this slide is realizing that if you take these components, and this is a clear key message to utilities, and in building these plans, you show what these components are and go to the previous slide and connect them to those review criteria. By connecting, in effect, then the costs associated with these components with the benefits identified in those review criteria, we're starting to now frame our benefit cost process and getting a step ahead of understanding what we mean when we talk about costs and immediate and longer term benefits. And so that's what that last bullet refers to on this slide as well. Continuing on in the world of language specifics now, as we try to get more and more specificity in our recommendations to the PRC, it's that within these plans that we also, beyond the components, that we start to talk in this broader language of how all of this fits together dynamically as a modernized grid. And in doing so, building off what we learned in various proceedings, that you can see is that we are building these sequential steps of the longer vision beyond just the next filing, but looking at how these filings build upon each other. And at a higher level, what you see here in these 5 bullets are in effect the stepping stones that are what is comprehensive grid modernization. So working from, as Art spoke to last month, advanced metering infrastructure, how that then sets the platform for current and improved hosting capacity analysis, how that interacts almost immediately with improved forecasting, and including how you do more forecasting around DERs and load-specific circumstances and needs, how that then sets a future foundation for increased transparency and oversight as we look at how the decisions historically made inside the utility regarding distribution level investments now come into a different arena, which is a more transparent arena, a more dynamic arena, and the challenging and exciting arena of how you look at wires and non-wires solutions and how you put that into the framework of comparing, contrasting solutions, and then recognizing that this is all in the greater milieu of other things happening, such as the PRC's focus on electric vehicle charging infrastructure and what that means to load management, and what that means as well to a very dynamic and kind of state-of-the-art modernized grid for New Mexico. Continuing on, and back to the presentation made by John Chenot of the Regulatory Systems Project, and then referenced by Art O'Donnell, is and to this point that you've heard repeatedly of how to leverage best practices and take advantage of those who've gone before New Mexico and the New Mexico jurisdictional utilities, is how to take this notion of more than one cost effectiveness methodology brought into the process, and that linkage between methodologies have different value for different purposes. And as you more discreetly identify the purpose of the investment and the costs being incurred, there's a different way to look at the methodology to understand, are we evaluating it to what its best purpose is as such. And so that's what this slide is getting at, of how to bring into New Mexico's version of grid modernization this concept of multiple methods of cost effectiveness and how to apply them to different circumstances, including even there was discussion about state-specific cost tests as well. So not to say that these are the exact tests to use, but that this concept of don't get restricted to a test or one test to fit all, but understand the connection between cost effectiveness tests and their purpose, and to bring that into the rule language as well, so that it's clear this is a discrete and expected part of the PRC regulatory process. From there, we go from rule language now to talking about some process improvements. And in process improvements, what we want to draw out here, and this may affect rule language, but it affects sort of messages back to the role of the PRC as the entity tasked constitutionally and statutorily with overseeing the regulation of jurisdictional utilities and the implementation of statutory and other policy, is how do we synchronize and integrate the proceedings that are going to be coming and already are in place in front of the PRC. I think it's a key thing to realize that the two key large takeaways here before we get into some details. One is that the more we get into the dynamics and the complexity of various planning processes, distribution system planning, as well as integrated resource planning, that each of these processes and the technologies they bring into grid modernization then change the approach utilities can take to tariffs and rate design. And the interactivity becomes more explicit between implementing new technologies and implementing new tariffs. And that's what's referenced here as an example, how demand response changes as you leverage AMI, as how time of use rates becomes more critical as EV infrastructure builds upon more EV demand upon the system. Similarly, how as more planning proceedings come into the arena of the PRC, building on the IRP into grid mod planning and its different aspects, then the potential of even how that interacts with transmission planning is realizing a key takeaway and lesson learned at the national level through many states working together through the Neighborhood Canazio Task Force, as well as other states who have gone further to fully implement that, is realizing the starting place to integrate resource distribution and transmission planning is a explicit commitment to using the same data sets as applicable between those planning proceedings, and being aware of where the outputs of one proceeding are inputs to another proceeding and vice versa. And that there is a, again, iterative and kind of cyclical process to this. And it can start in different places. IRP probably, because it's sort of the most experienced of such, is sort of the wheel that's spinning now, but how do these other proceedings integrate with IRP? That's the message here. Continuing on, that when it comes to process improvements as well, that we are moving from discrete steps, and we'll talk in a minute about where PRC is with advanced metering, but how we're moving toward the increasing complexity of distribution system planning and realizing that that's going to happen in phases. And it begins with AMI and it evolves into DER integration. And I think the key lesson learned from other states and from the labs is how you leverage AMI to improve forecasting and hosting capacity, which I spoke to earlier, and then how you can use that to identify discrete bids and distribution system needs as a step into a more dynamic way and a more publicly and regulatory involved system, and then how that sets the platform for incorporating DERs and non-wireless alternatives. So to be aware that that's the intentional vision, that there's a complexity building to distribution system planning in phases. I think just to draw two slides here from Lisa Schwartz from LBNL and their Grid Modernization Laboratory Consortium reiterates that point. And I think the key takeaway I want to share here is that you start with baseline information. So you start with where you're at now, and that the planning processes start with a description of what are the processes today. So it's an acknowledgement. You have to start with what you have. And you also start by incorporating current operations, in this case, vegetation management, events management. That's the platform upon which you start to build to a more dynamic DSP process. That then takes you into, as Ms. Schwartz pointed out, then into DER forecasting, hosting capacity, grid needs assessment. It all builds sequentially upon itself. And I think it's such a critical part to what we're talking about here. It was worth drawing those two slides back from Ms. Schwartz's presentation and just kind of reiterating that point here. Continuing on, just a few final points here about process as before we draw this to our close for our time presenting to you today, is to acknowledge that while mentioning there is this need to sequence activities, that it's not as if things are static today and we are advocating to become dynamic. Things are dynamic. There are AMI filings, as noted here, and the status of the 3 jurisdictional IOUs and where they stand with their filings, and thus being sensitive, cognizant of that is already in place. And how does that relate to rulemaking? And then further, so looking beyond that to current and future types of AMI and other filings, is to build upon what's there, but to build with this intention of sequencing and adding the complexity. So we start to build off that to require this assessment of the status of the grid and of operations. That's to that point you just saw in Ms. Schwartz's slides. You then identify incremental approaches to increasing utility engagement with distribution level data planning and filings. Again, showing what's been reiterated in other slides, this notion that each time we're going with greater complexity, but you start with where you're at, you start with filings that maybe start, as say, with AMI, and then you build off AMI. And then, but to be clear, in each filing, it has the links to future filings. So while not only saying this is our plan for implementing AMI, but what are the intended uses of the AMI capabilities? What are the timing of implementing each use of those capabilities? And how does it relate to the future filings? So that within a proceeding, we're not just talking about the current filing, but what is it setting up coming in the future? I think that's critical from a regulatory process improvement. Then just finally on process improvement as well, that this notion of future filings, getting beyond even just talking about distribution systems and upgrades. And there is some direction already in the PRC. Again, nothing is static, it's dynamic, but it's building upon what's in place currently. It's looking toward future IRP proceedings, because that is sort of a cornerstone of the regulatory engagement between the PRC and jurisdictional utilities, and how to improve and coordinate that IRP process with what's being gained through this grid modernization process. And then always articulating this vision to evolve the planning process and how that fits into rule language, fits into orders that articulate where the vision of the PRC or both. And so I will bring you to reiterating key conclusions that hopefully you've heard from us. Hopefully you see reflect what's been brought forth in our time together through our series of webinars. And just to reiterate that we stand at a place where our clear recommendation to the PRC is it's time to move forward with grid modernization rulemaking. That to move forward, the next obvious step is to start creating draft language and then to initiate a formal process. It's through the framing of that language that sets the next context of how to continue engaging stakeholders, and to Chair Hall's comments and to the other commissioners' comments. The value of stakeholder process, both with the jurisdictional regulated entities and all others who participate in this, is critical, that we move that to the structure now of language. And then secondly, that the PRC embrace this leadership role that's called for in grid modernization, that it sets forth the key milestones of AMI, as Mr. O'Donnell spoke to where the other component parts that we've all learned about that comprise what is distribution system planning that then takes us in and integrates with grid modernization, and then how those process improvements just discussed back to HECO and cost effectiveness, to presumption of prudence, and bringing those pieces into this while realizing this is incremental, and that we need to make sure that in that incremental approach that utilities know their systems better than others. They know what's going on in their area. They know what works within their domain. So it's the dynamic tension between leadership from the PRC and discretion to the utilities to say, in our circumstance, we see this piece moves before this piece, or these two pieces move together. That makes sense to be the utilities domain, as long as we still understand what the comprehensive whole is that is being pursued. And then to the third point, that this is all to prepare for an ongoing increasing complexity of process. And complexity is something to embrace versus to be concerned or fearful about, but that it may cause a need to look at what's coming before the commission or in the pipeline, where to set pauses as necessary to better sequence rules preceding filings, as to make that communication between regulator and regulated entity as effective as possible. And then to anticipate even those future linkages as discussed. When does it make sense to make sure that an IRP is best synchronized with grid modernization? Where does transmission planning fit into that as well? So with that, hopefully I've taken you through from our broad sense to the most specifics and an understanding of how we logically get to these conclusions and how it reflects both what you've heard, what we've heard from you, and how we've been engaging with each other. So with that, I think that brings us into a discussion. I'm going to put that slide there, but actually, Deb, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and bring it back to you and Amanda. Thanks.
So I wanted to ask participants first if they have any clarifying questions of anything that Jeff presented, and we can go back to slides if we need to. Does anybody have any clarifying questions? I'd love you to turn on your cameras if you could. Well, I know you can, it's whether you will. Morning, Pat. Hello, Matthew.
Greetings,
Lauren.
everybody. And hopefully you had a chance to see the slides, possibly in advance. If not, I see that Matthew Tisdale shared a link with you. You have the slides as well to reference, so you see what we're articulating. So,
Clarifying questions. Anything you didn't understand or that you thought you needed more information on? Okay, Jeff, you covered a lot of material. Oh, go ahead.
Did I hear someone?
I apologize. This is Kevin Gedko from the Attorney General's office. I got pulled away for a quick second there. With respect to the pausing of filings, do you want to give any more detail on that? It raises a question for me of wanting that AMI infrastructure to be established so that the other pieces can happen, but that's balanced with also wanting to have, ideas of how you're going to take advantage of that infrastructure when you put that infrastructure in. And it's a difficult balance that I've seen in the cases that we've been handling of the willingness to go forward with basic AMI infrastructure, and how much detail we want to already have established as to the use of that infrastructure, which, are all topics you've talked about. And could you maybe expand a little bit on how you associate that with these statements with respect to the pausing of filings?
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I appreciate it. You're the attorney. I presume you're an attorney, given who you work for. I'm not the attorney. I have experienced this as a commissioner. I think the message being, and I'm more familiar with other states' process, although I was looking at your APA process here this morning to understand context for where New Mexico PRC gets its authority. With all that as pretext, what I'm saying here is sensitive to due process, that when an applicant files something, that there is a process that's expected and a process that's initiated, but at the same time that there's a logic and there's just a rationale to say, if we're well aware that rules are forthcoming that affect what you're planning to file, is there a willingness on behalf of the applicant to take a pause in by X number of months in their filing to then let the rules go into effect so that we know more clearly? It's the art of what rule promulgation is. It's communicating to the applicant's expectations. Otherwise, all that becomes a matter of the record in that proceeding, where without rules in place, each of those now is going to have to become a matter of litigation to say, well, the commission sort of hopes for or intended this. We don't have rules yet, but what we'd like to see is more testimony on this. That's the dynamic I think you're working in that place. And what I'm getting at here is, if you're hearing what you're hearing from GridWorks, is that it's time to move forward with this conversation with particular language about what does the PRC mean by grid modernization plans, and the sequencing of plans, that acknowledging there are 3 AMI plans already in place, not saying pause on those. Those are well along and should be completed, but that those are likely less than what the next round of filings are. So before additional filings in the name of grid mod under HB 233 happen, signaling from the PRC that their intent is to take a pause on those kind of filings until these rules are in place, so that folks are clear what the PRC's intentions are going forward and how future proceedings synchronize. Does that help you, Kevin?
Yeah, there was some, yes, that's helpful. Yes, and I apologize that my camera's not on this computer. It's not recognizing my camera. But yes, some of what you said there, especially with respect to existing filings, it's helpful to see your perspective on that.
I appreciate your clarification. Yeah, that's why I referenced in with the help of what I saw in Art O'Donnell's presentation in June. There are filings, one that's, I think, probably by now close to a final order. I know it's through the ALJ process. 2 others that are coming along. I think one that's been suspended a little bit to this fall. All those, I think on behalf of GridWorks, not saying suspend those. There's a lot of record there and a lot of due process that needs to be honored and carried through.
Yeah. Jim.
Yeah, Jim, go off mute if you would. And
I'm sorry, I didn't hear my name called. I was distracted for a moment. Thank you very much. And again, really happy that we can participate and be part of these workshops. They've been great. In one of the slides, there was a mention of proven technology. And I've noticed there seems to be a difference of opinion among some of the participants as to what is proven and what is not proven. And I'm concerned that depending upon how that is actually implemented, that it could be a barrier to utilizing newer technology. So I was wondering if you could elaborate, on how that term is actually applied. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. No, I think you're right. You're moving from the art of language between us today to the science of language that goes into a rule. And whether or not the phrase proven technology would ever show up in regulatory language is an open question. I watch the EPA use things like, best system,
Available,
best current, whatever. Those kind of things, BSER or whatever they are. I'm saying this is more meant to be metaphorical to say AMI is in the market now. Folks are using that. That is a proven technology. It is in place. Utilities are using AMI now. I'm not saying to what UL standard that AMI is. That's not what we're here to speak to. But that AMI is clearly a proven technology. As it's implemented, it should be leveraged, and we should understand what that means. If you get to different iterations of how to manage voltage optimization on the grid, that's heading toward proven technology. I think folks are implementing that pretty well. So I think you look to the market, tells you what is proven by what's being implemented. If there's something that is sort of still under development, I can't think of an example offhand. Yeah, that's a different mean. But our intent in that language phrase there was to acknowledge there are things, especially with New Mexico, learning from other states and other utilities that are down the path. If they're already using it and doing it, I think that's a pretty clear proven technology.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Curtis, we see your hand.
Yes, Thank you. I had a quick question. You're talking about the DPS plans filing every 3 years. And I was wondering, we do an IRP already every 3 years. Would that be a part of the IRP or a major input into the IRP?
Great question. Yeah, thanks, Curtis. Yeah, that reference to 3 years comes, I believe, out of the white paper that came from the Grid Modernization Advisory Group, where they recommended 3 years. I think that there's two parts to what you're saying there. One is that kind of sequence seems to be a fairly normal sequence for those kind of plans, is about 3 years. I think you mentioned IRPs are on a 3-year cycle in New Mexico. I've seen 2 to 4 in the studies we've done across the West. And so I think it's important, and this is a key detail to be worked out through putting draft red line language on the table and seeing what actually works, is figuring out that synchronization. If it's going to also be on a 3-year cycle, making sure that it's somewhere between 1 year, year and a half off cycle, both for the utilities burden and benefit and for the PRC's burden and benefit. And then furthermore, I have seen, and I think whether or not GridWorks will reflect this in our report, is the notion of how to possibly put each of the utilities on a different cycle so that not all 3 plans show up at the same time. There's pros and cons to that as well. Those are things that utilities and other stakeholders should speak to as detailed language comes forward for grid modernization rules. Does that help you with that, Curtis? Great.
And Matthew from EPE is reacting to these loaded words, prudent utility practice standards. So I don't know if Jeff, when you said that, if you want to add any color to that, why you said
yeah, I think I used the word presumption, or the phrase presumption of prudence is what I was talking about. And that's a phrase from my background, and I think is fairly standard to utility regulatory practices. And the point that we're trying to make here is to be explicitly clear that when the PRC approves a plan, and a plan has a utility calling for particular investments that are of an asset level, be it a grid mod plan, distribution system plan, IRP plan, what is signaled by that PRC approval of that plan regarding the level of presumption of prudency for investments made subsequent to that plan that are concurrent with the content of the plan. How much presumption of prudence, or rebuttable, I think I said, the rebuttable presumption, so that if the plan said go forth and do X, and the X was this piece of equipment, or to the degree that it even had the results of a bid inside the plan, that is a higher presumption of prudence, because you now know what we think that asset's going to cost. And if it comes in within range of that cost and it matches the plan, that's a fairly high presumption of prudence. If it was more generally, go forth and do good work in the name of AMI, that's a fairly low presumption of prudence, if you follow what I'm saying. So it's how much details in the plan, and was the plan approved, and based on that approval, what is the rebuttable presumption of prudence that then it doesn't preclude consumer advocates and PRC staff and any party from challenging, but your challenge is going to have some constraints around it based upon the content of what was approved. Does that help? Great.
And I just want to add in that every state looks at this issue differently, because it is about the money and approving money. It is fraught. It is complicated. So New Mexico is going to approach it the way New Mexico decides to approach it. I think what Jeff mentioned is, I think what we see as very beneficial, because you don't want to do all the work of plans and then get questioned when you come in for the funding. So we think that this makes sense, but every state does it differently. So let's go to Lauren.
Yes, hi. Jeff, I wanted just to comment that the overall outline of phased incremental implementation of a grid mod set of rules is, I think the correct approach. I mean, it reflects where we are in New Mexico at the moment. I think it's an accurate representation of, we have a long way to go in many areas. I wanted to specifically mention a follow on to the EPE question regarding DSP, Distribution System Plan. I was involved with the white paper number 6 derivation with a group of experts. There was a lot of discussion internally, and actually it's been called out in the white paper number 6 white paper regarding the cost of implementation. And I think this is more than specific. It's not only specific to DSP, but so a lot of the action items that you've called out have cost of implementation, within the utility area. And I think it's an issue that needs to be kept in mind as the GridWorks finalizes its recommendations. Potential cost of implementation of filing a distribution system plan every years. It's an additional cost in modeling and staff time, and actually we had recognized that in the white paper discussion. So,
Lauren, thanks. Appreciate that point. I appreciate you clarifying what you're talking about. The kind of overhead operating, the costs, the human costs of staffing and operations. And so, because I was going to ask you to clarify, but you did, and it's a critical point, and I appreciate you raising that. I think it also begs the point of how, as you set this longer vision in a process like this, to not just create more proceedings, but better proceedings. And so that over time, what you can get to is that it's not an IRP followed by a DSP file or a grid mod, but how does that become one comprehensive whole someday? And how do they all, because we don't necessarily need to have each of these be standalone. It's the walk, jog, run approach to this. But is there a way that we can keep in mind that hopefully by doing this, you get better proceedings that have the same content and you don't need as many, and possibly the frequency can change as well. But those are good points that can be factored in and that the PRC should take into consideration. Thanks.
Sure.
So that was great discussion. Thank you. I wanted to move on and ask the question that we posed at the very top was, how well did what Jeff just present reflect what you all heard in the grid modernization series? And are there things you agree with, or are there things you don't agree with? And I'm seeing our poll up here. So we're starting with our poll. How well did GridWorks conclusions and recommendations reflect what you heard in the series, with number 5 being high? You guys know how to do this. We've done this every time. Okay, everybody entered? Okay. Yep, I think we can share results. And I see that only 54% of the people have participated. So if you want to add in. Okay, Deb, let's share the results because I can't figure out whether you guys can see the results. You can see the results? Okay, thank you for that. Okay. So it looks like 4s and 5s mainly, and if you add up those two percentages, it's a very high percent. So let's talk about, we don't want to call out those 2s or 3s, but I hope that in the discussion you'll be able to relay to us some of what you think is divergent, what you didn't think we reflected correctly. So does anybody want to offer a thumbs up or tell us how you think we did reflect what you heard, or how you think we didn't reflect what you heard in this series? And I will call on people if I need to.
I think this is Matt. I'll just volunteer one thing, and I'm just re-scrolling through the slides again. And again, I recognize that you all will produce a paper that gets more into this and provides the additional clarification. But this really comes down to one of the things I think I raised constantly throughout is cost. I said it multiple times. I'll say it again, but with a twist this time. You can't have a Hawaii appetite on a New Mexico budget. And so I think it's going to be very crucial that the figuring out how to recover costs needs to be central to any rulemaking, which is another reason why I believe a statutory answer is better, because at that point, that does provide you the certainty. It does provide you the buy-in and everything else necessary. I do recognize how broad the legislation is written. That's why getting that legislative clarity is so key, but it comes down to that cost and understanding that we need certainty. The utilities need some confidence that they're not going to make all these investments and then be left holding the bag when it comes time to pay for what's delivered, and then we get accused of gold plating and all these other accusations, and it doesn't work. And then we're in a catch-22. Do we move forward aggressively with these broad ideas? Do we and then risk being pilloried for that, or do we prefer to be pilloried for not moving aggressively enough and erring on the side of being overly cost conscious? And that's something that rulemakings should really, especially bold rulemakings as this, really need to keep in mind. And with that, I do have to jump onto another call here shortly, so I do apologize. That's another reason why I quickly interrupted, so I apologize.
Yeah, no worries, Matthew. We appreciate your participation. Certainly that has been a clear theme coming from you, and I will tell you that that's one of the reasons we concentrated on the cost-benefit analysis, because you all should be able to show AMI investment leads to all these future savings. And so part of it is making a good case for why are you making these investments, which gives the information to the commission to be able to approve. And it's also why Jeff mentioned presumption of prudence, because that's another thing where you are showing that your course through the applications is prudent, because you're showing a logical progression of where the savings and benefits are from the investment, because there's always going to be investment. And I saw that Art had a note in the chat about, is there something specific that you actually would like to see in the rule? And I know you have to go, but we'd love to hear if there are specific things, and we can take comments after this as well.
Sorry, I do apologize. That'd be something that I'd have to really just mull over and talk internally with our folks on. But I think one of the things, depending on, an easy one to point out is if there's a desire for quick investment in building up, for instance, and that's the direction that we wish to move. I apologize for closing my eyes. I have to do that when I'm thinking through something. And so with that, if there's a desire maybe to push forward that investment, maybe you follow a model that some of the other regulators, commissions have done, whereby you allow for that. You state that we'll get a recovery on that. We can maybe recover in advance if there's this desired push. But and I think something like that would be nice to know, because then that provides us more certainty as we make that investment, and we understand that we have that backing for a lot of certain of these core ideas that the commission really wants. And then that way we have that delineation of, okay, this is core, this is something that you're more likely going to recover or can recover in advance, subject to obviously reconciliation. And then this other half of this is sort of more of a fun experimental. These are the standards over here. And then the other thing that I would say from a costing factor would be helpful to make sure that we have that delineation between, hey, not everything falls into this new world, or excuse me, to the extent that we have certain items fall within the traditional distribution, transmission, CCN sort of infrastructure, we, to the extent that we're looking to have that incorporated there, making sure that those standards are tweaked to help facilitate that as well. But again, I apologize. I know inartful on the spot. I apologize. And with that, I'm going to go. Thank you very much for your time and very much for all the effort that you and your team have done. I really greatly appreciate it.
Matthew, that was very helpful. Those comments were very helpful. So really appreciate that. Thanks for being part of the series. So other folks that want to provide some color, some response to what's been presented today, where we got it right, where we maybe need some extra clarity or a little bit of change. So I know I saw Mike from Excel on the call earlier. If he's still on, can I call on you?
Hi, I know it still says Mike on the screen. You have Mike and Brooke with Excel. So nice to see everyone. I haven't joined many of these workshops. So for those who don't know me, this is Brooke Trammell, Regional Vice President, Regulatory and Pricing for Excel Energy. Thanks for having the workshop today, and I've enjoyed listening. And it's hard for me not to say Chair Ackerman, but Jeff, it was nice to listen through the recommendations and appreciate how you articulated the recommendation of GridWorks and stepped through some of those recommendations for the NMPRC to proceed on with this effort.
Thanks. Thanks, Brooke.
Any,
Good to see you.
Any comments, suggestions, reactions, positive, negative to what was presented in specifics?
Yeah, again, with the caveat that I personally haven't been through the entire process here, being relatively new and back to SPS. I think a lot of work has gone into the effort. I think Jeff characterized a lot of things well when he said there's going to be a lot of evolution of the filings, of the technologies, of the infrastructure proposals that utilities may bring forward, but also the customer adoption and value of different programs and different ways to utilize, right, and bring more value out of those proposals. And also the increasing complexity of the plans themselves in whatever plan we're referring. I'm curious if there was a prior discussion in the series of workshops, and again, apologies for not being around for all of them, in kind of a phased approach to anything. So, I think of like a phase 1, phase 2 type construct where you have some orientation, some level setting on directions, or the commission or the rules, or some structures saying, these are kind of the assumptions, the key inputs. We're gonna make decisions around those inputs and then kind of fill in going forward. So Jeff, if that's anything that you had thought about or worked on through this process.
Yeah, Brooke, thanks. And SPS is great to have you back in their territory. I think referencing to, and I would commend you looking at Lisa Schwartz's slide deck from early, I think it was our second or third webinar, where we started broadly with her help from Lawrence Berkeley Lab, to look at least at a sequence from how you build into more and more distribution system planning. And she, if I recall right, references several other states. We always commended our presenters for trying to draw in the specifics of other states. And so you'll see some of that in there. It may not speak as much to what I heard in part of your query having to do with how that works with interactive with the regulatory process, or, signaling sort of what the intention is for this phase, getting filings, working off that, then go to a next phase. That may be more implicit in there in terms of how the role of the regulator in that process. But I think you raised a good point in that in what you're hopefully hearing from GridWorks is a need for the PRC to put some of that out front and say, this is what our intention is, both near term and longer term, so that folks know we are ready for these types of filings now, anticipating this level of complexity now, but knowing that that additional complexity is going to happen later. It may well be that you see this as you and I are both experienced with let's say in a Colorado example of in between each filing, for better or for worse, you see modification of the rules too. And sometimes that can just be onerous to kind of watch Colorado go through totally redoing its electric resource planning rules every 4 years, because we do 4-year filings here. But there could be that type of iterative improvement of a regulatory process that could be included in that.
Yeah, and also recognizing that some of the investments need to be, there's foundational components that can be built on for future things. So, I think some of the enabling investments may come in phases too. And if I captured some of the recommendations correctly, it sounded like GridWorks' recommendations certainly contemplate that progression through the focus and intent on, the linked filings and the linked nature of whether it's a individual application or an actual plan, a longer term, maybe 3-year plan, that those things link.
And I would reiterate in that point, and this is this dynamic between how much the regulator can be directive and how much the utility needs to initiate, and that tension between the two, that by making sure that when a discrete plan comes, that it's not just talking about what the plan represents, but how the plan is setting the foundation for the next filing. And you and I recall this from other iterations. We're trying to not get too far afield from the bounds of the filing itself, but if the filing's about AMI or about AMI as an entry into distribution system planning, to have the utility through directive through what is meant to be in the content of a filing, speak to what are the components you're bringing in now, what are the components, and how does that set a foundation for the components you see in a future filing. And so because that kind of sequencing, I don't think is something that GridWorks is trying to say of the 12 different discrete parts of grid modernization put in HB 233, this is how they should be sequenced. That is clearly in the domain of the expertise of the utility, but we all know that is what comprehensive grid modernization is, and we know we need to get there. What does each utility see as how you would propose which 2 to 5 pieces are happening now and which 3 to 4 are coming next and which ones are coming later? Something like that is sort of what the message is there.
And and last question is, GridWorks' recommendation that those types of proposals come in the form of grid modernization applications, or they're presented in distribution system plans for consideration and approved, or maybe a third option that they're presented in distribution system plans and then the utility, they're reviewed and then the utility moves on in a subsequent grid modernization application for the specific things found to have had a need in that plan filing.
You're raising a really good point about sort of level of complexity, and we have sort of somewhat concentric circles here of the most discrete, like a grid mod application, which 233 speaks to, or AMI plan applications that are in front of the commission right now is sort of level 1 of complexity. And then from there goes into that's building toward distribution system plans. And in there, we envision even now, and terminology is important here, and maybe we have not been as clear as we can be, and that's good feedback, that it needs a sort of larger grid modernization plan of how does the utility see all this fitting together, and that the utility is starting to articulate that sooner versus later in that plan that could be a component of another filing. I'll ask my colleagues also if they want to weigh in, and if my language isn't coming across clear. Amanda or Matthew on that. Any other thoughts on that, or did that come across clear to you?
Yeah, Brooke, I think, Matthew, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, Jeff, your thinking there is consistent with what I would recommend, which is something more holistic that the filings then follow. And I would point to the example that comes to my mind most clearly is the Hawaiian electric grid modernization plan from about 5 or 6 years ago, which actually wasn't, if memory serves, an approved, sort of a commission approved document. It was a statement or something put forward by the utility. And then lots of filings followed that referenced that plan, giving it some cohesion and grounding in that plan. how the PRC would prefer to go forward here, whether they want to have an approved grid modernization plan and then applications subsequent to that, I think will be an interesting discussion for them to have. But what I think we have in mind, what we're recommending is something along the lines of what HECO put forward that then guided a lot of regulatory activity.
And
That's
Brooke,
very, yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. Because I've heard grid mod plan, I've heard grid mod application, I've heard distribution system plan, I've heard distribution plan. So I think that'd be important just to, define terms and be, like you said, Jeff, real intentional about the language that we use and what its meaning would be going forward. So appreciate that. And that was all the questions I had, Mike. I don't know if you had anything more, or Amanda, if you had a specific question for Mike.
No, I don't have any other.
Thank you.
Okay, Brooke, thank you so much. I just wanted to second when you said foundational components that enable progression, because I think that with AMI, that's how the New Mexico is looking, is that's like, let's get some foundational things that will lead to other components and then system benefits. So appreciate you articulating that. Thanks for all the feedback. That's super helpful for us. So I want to put on the spot John from PNM, or Deborah, I guess, is also on from PNM. Do either one of you want to make any comments?
Good morning, this is Debria Twiloger from
Debria,
PNM.
sorry.
Thank you, Amanda. Yeah, and I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage with as Brooke is, in the sense that I have not been actively participating on behalf of PNM in this proceeding, although I have been watching some of the webinars and getting caught up since I'm helping with the October filing that will come in for PNM. And so, I know from talking with Leslie Padilla and Brian Buffington, who have been more actively participating in this proceeding, one of the most important things from PNM's perspective is that the procedures and the rule are clear. And I think you heard a little bit about this, or heard this a little bit from Brooke, in the sense that we need to have some clear understanding of the progression and how grid mod fits into discussions here of a distribution system planning, where each of those components come in, and the timing, and how the commission's thinking that about the progression of or the components of grid modernization and how that will progress for the utilities. I was really good to hear. I also have a hard time not calling Jeff Ackerman chair here, hearing Jeff voice that it's important that there be a trust between the regulator and the utility, as to the utility knows its system, and the utility knows when and how it can implement certain components of grid mod. And we would reemphasize that there's that utility flexibility or utility specificity that's mentioned in the slides here needs to really be taken into account into the rules, as to when the utility, with discussion and with coordination with the regulator, can really progress on these different components based on what the system can handle. And then I think, as you heard from what the EPE representative stated, as to the cost to our customers, so I'm happy to be here, happy to get caught up on all of that's going on in grid mod, and we look forward to this formal process that will go and really reviewing the rules. I don't know if John Hawkins wants to add anything to what I volunteered.
Yeah, and sorry, I don't have ability on camera on this one either. I agree with Debria, and yeah, the definition I think is going to be critical, because typically I speak from the technical side, and so I understand how difficult this can be to wrangle all those cats, I guess, on the utility side, and how to put it all together into a very, very cohesive way, and then also to understand how to use the crystal ball for lack of a better term, right? Because a lot of this is very forward looking. Technology is going to change, rules are going to change, lots of things are going to change on this as we're doing this. And so how to, some understanding and some leeway that some of this is crystal ball for us as well. I believe is also going to be important as we move through some of these filings, because it's really taking us into a kind of a new era in terms of the way our system will operate. So maybe I just add that from the technical side.
Great. Debrea, sorry for butchering your name. It's a beautiful name. And John, thanks for the input. Really helpful to hear from all the utilities specifically. Before we wind up, I just wanted to open it up. We had many stakeholders during this series. Many of you are on the phone today, and wanted to give you an opportunity to reflect back to us anything you heard or concerns, or if you think this will work in your state. You've committed a lot of time, so I'd like to provide you the opportunity. Jim.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you very much. And yeah, thanks again for the series of workshops. I just want to reflect back on a couple things. And I'm speaking on behalf of the Renewable Energy Industries Association of New Mexico. We're known by a lot of folks by our acronym REIA, but we are also very interested in certainty. And certainty, I think, is just important. I think everyone agreed that that's extremely important, as well as clarity. But I want to also circle back to webinar 8. And by the way, the presentation on evaluation methods for grid investments in DERs, and I'm actually looking at the hard copy right now. I've read it a couple of times. And when I read that, it really brings me back to, yes, cost is important, but I think overall we need to strive for value. And I just want to make that point. Thank you.
Perfect. John.
Yeah, and just another brief, I guess, extension of what I said a second ago when trying to talk about looking into the future. I think the other piece of it is we also have to understand, and we got some of these questions at a previous AMI filing, so why aren't you doing this like Chicago did it, or why aren't you doing it like? And we can, I think, all agree that Chicago's climate and all kinds of things are a lot different than New Mexico. Their load profiles, their device, right? And so we have to be a little bit careful about, while I think in general we might be able to be compared to other, and we, even as utilities, we look at other jurisdictions as good indicators of things that are working or not working. We have to be a little bit careful who we're comparing ourselves against and how we're comparing ourselves in some ways. I think El Paso Electric even talked about it a little bit, is we certainly can't have a Hawaii or a California ideal of what we want to be on a New Mexico budget. So like I said, I just want to make sure that we're being careful of the analogies or the comparisons that we're trying to draw, to make sure that we can really understand it and even have some leeway to say, I don't necessarily know what this will look like in New Mexico. It seemed like a good idea in X jurisdiction, but it's not quite like New Mexico. So we might need a little leeway in that regard too.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think one of the benefits of being where New Mexico is that there are a lot of folks that have done tons of work in this area that you can actually look and see what they have done. But you're right, comparison can be tricky. Other comments? This is our last webinar, so it's your last time to let us know something, anything. Arthur.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda, and thank you, everyone. We really appreciate the continued involvement. And now I really feel like we're getting kind of like your real thoughts, right? Not just kind of like knee-jerk responses, but really thinking through this. And I do want to touch on this issue of cost and what New Mexico can afford. you really have to understand that if New Mexico does not move forward, it will be at a serious disadvantage to other jurisdictions in terms of recruiting economic development. If you do not have a grid that is responsive to both your residential and commercial and industrial customers and the new class of customers that are coming in, the Facebooks, the Amazon distribution systems, New Mexico will lose out on that. It is impossible to predict exactly what the cost of this is going to be. We know that it's going to involve new investment, okay? Investment leads to benefits. That's where the key is. So for the commission's point of view, and this is what I try and promulgate in my discussions with the commissioners, is that we have to understand how to make that balance going forward. That yes, costs will have to be incurred, but if we don't move forward, there will be significant costs as well. They're harder to quantify because you have lost opportunities that you can never really put a dollar figure on. So that's why we get to, trying to make it so that the utilities do have the opportunity to recover their costs so that ratepayers do gain benefits from these investments. Exactly what that means for each component of grid modernization, I can't say because it's an ongoing field and there's a lot of evolution. But I hope that everybody keeps that in mind because New Mexico can't get stuck in the 20th century. We have to move forward. I was talking to a woman who represents Google at the recent neighborhood conference down in San Diego. And, if you want Google's business, you're going to have to be looking at a 100% clean energy delivery system, right? That's what's at stake here. So I just want to leave with that because I think that is a really key component.
Thanks for those comments, Art. Very helpful. I also wanted to mention that Matthew put in the chat for Brooke and others the HECO document that was kind of a predecessor of all their planning, their kind of policy statement. So last comments before we do a quick wrap up.
Well, if no one else is going to pop on, I'll just say thanks for letting me make the late entrance and appearance. Appreciate everyone's work on this effort. I agree with a lot of what Art said. I agree with a lot of the previous speakers. There's value to be had here. Reliability and affordability are cornerstones of Xcel Energy's proposals. It's what goes through our decision making and our considerations. And every utility has a unique customer base here in New Mexico, but I think the commission is definitely looking for a grid modernization effort to benefit the whole state and to move New Mexico along. So as someone returning to New Mexico and with family here, and I've done a lot of economic activities through my life, not just with Xcel, but through going to school here and other things, appreciate the focus and the value and the desire to make things better in New Mexico for New Mexicans and certainly for our customers. So thank you all.
Boy, I think that's a great note to end on. So thank you for that, Brooke. Deborah, can we put up the survey? So we have two last things we just want to make sure you're aware of. We've got a survey. We're going to ask you to do that right now, if you would. That way it's done. Only take just a second. And we did want to let you know that our timeline is to produce a report by the end of August. So please stay on and go to this link. It should work for everyone. If it doesn't, we can also put it in the chat and fill that out. And as you do that, I just want to take a moment to say, I have so enjoyed being able to get to know the folks in New Mexico. I live in Arizona. I know some of you, being able to spend some time has been good for me just to understand more about the dynamics. And, the state has so much possibility and you all are really working hard to make it better. So I appreciate that. So please go to the survey and fill it out.
Great. Now, while folks are clicking on that survey and taking less than 5 minutes, I hope, to finish it, I want to thank the team here who has worked really hard over almost 5 months to make this series possible. I'll start with Amanda Orman, our lead facilitator. Thank you, Amanda, for your guidance and steady hand here. Jeff, thank you for your expertise and experience from the Colorado sphere in particular that I think has been so useful here. I also want to thank and appreciate Deborah Shields, who has been behind the curtain there, making so much of the communication and logistics of this process so smooth. Congratulations, Deb, on some awesome project management. I also want to thank from the New Mexico PRC team, obviously Commissioner Chair Hall, who has been very steady in her leadership of this process and very engaged and thoughtful, I think. Also, two folks from the logistics team, Isaac in memory. We will miss you, Isaac, and appreciate all that you contributed to this. And Miguel, who has stepped up to fill in for Isaac in implementing the last of the workshops. And then last but not least, our DOE fellow in residence there at the PRC, Art O'Donnell, who has been a great resource guiding us and inspiring this process. I think I missed one more person, which is Margie Tatro, who has deep roots there in New Mexico and has been embedded in the GridWorks team, helping us think clearly and locally about this process. So let me give a shout out also to Margie. I hope I haven't forgotten anyone. As you can see, we're lucky to have a big and awesome team making this webinar possible. So on behalf of GridWorks, and I know by extension, the PRC leadership, thank you to you all for the time and energy you've put into making this happen.
Great. So we are not going to show the results of the survey. That's for our internal purposes, so we can try to make these better. I also wanted to thank the commissioners that have showed up for these meetings. I think it's really important to have that mix and to show you that they are interested in this, because there's a lot of work ahead, and certainty has come up so many times about providing some guidance and certainty so you all can make the investments you need to make. So I really appreciate everybody's time. And I think we have no big grand exit. So when you're done with the survey, if you want to get on the camera and wave bye-bye, we appreciate it. And we will look forward to having your review of the report when it comes out in August and receive comments from you.
Is the link working for everyone on the survey side? Anybody have trouble with that?
I've been having trouble with it.
Okay, good. Thanks, Mike. Kind of anticlimactic, right? We should have fireworks or something going off in the background, like we made it. 5 months went by very quickly. So you're welcome, once you're done with the survey, just to drop off and we'll know that people have completed it, and we really appreciate your time.
All right, if we can end the recording, Miguel, that would be appreciated.
I don't know that he's on.
Yeah, I just sent him a chat.
They've got the open meeting going on right now.
Let me text him.
Deborah, I think you can end the recording.